So my name is Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, and I am just so excited about this panel today. This is the workshop of the ASALA Howard Mellon Social Justice Consortium Workshop. And it takes the form of a roundtable discussion of the book Justice Deferred, Race and the Supreme Court. And this book is written by historian Orville Vernon Burton and attorney Armand Durfner. The book's authors have a long and illustrious record as defenders of racial justice in America. Vernon Burton is the inaugural Judge Matthew J. Perry Distinguished Chair of History and Professor of Global Studies, Sociology, Anthropology, Computer Science at Clemson University. And I just want to say for myself and for anyone who knew and remembers the great civil rights lawyer and later federal judge, Matthew Perry, it is indeed an honor to hold an endowed chair that bears his name. Vernon Burton taught for 34 years at the University of Illinois, where he is now emeritus. He is a prolific and prize-winning author who writes about race relations in the United States, and equally important, he uses his knowledge about race as an expert witness for civil rights cases. The book Justice Deferred is co-authored with Armand Durfner, who for more than 50 years has been a civil rights lawyer and constitutional lawyer. His victories in several cases before the Supreme Court helped to shape the Voting Rights Act and also helped to desegregate state legislatures and state university systems across the South. In addition to having a law firm in Charleston, South Carolina, Armand Durfner is also scholar in residence in constitutional law at the Charleston School of Law. Now we will begin our roundtable with 3 presenters, 2 of whom are academics and the other a practicing lawyer. They will share their thoughts for the first hour, the first half of this plenary, and then afterward, the authors of Justice Deferred will make comments. And finally, we will open up to the audience for question and answer. Because some of our audience is live streamed, I will also include their questions if you have questions or with your questions. So now to introduce our presenters. Our first presenter will be Hillary Green. She is the James B. Duke Professor of Africana Studies at Davidson College. She is the author of Educational Reconstruction, African American Schools in the Urban South, 1865 to 1890. And she co-authored with Keith Herbert a report published in 2022 for the National Park Service and the Organization of American Historians. It's called Historic Resource Study on History in African American Schools, 1865 to 1900. Robert L. Harris is Professor Emeritus of African American History, American Studies, and Public Affairs at Cornell University. He's also Vice Provost for Diversity and Development, Emeritus at Cornell. Robert Harris has served as the president of ASALA in 1991 and 1992. He has received numerous awards, among them ASALA's Carter G. Woodson Medallion in 2003. And more recently, Phi Alpha Fraternity awarded him its highest honor, the Alpha Award of Merit in 2019. He has published, among other works, teaching African American history, the history of Alpha Phi Alpha, a tradition of leadership and service. And he co-edited with Rosalind Terborg Penn, the Columbia Guide to African American History since 1939. Fred Gray is a legendary civil rights lawyer. He knows firsthand about the American legal process, about taking the battle for justice all the way to the Supreme Court. And Fred Gray has seen, and he has been an active part of, the historical narrative of when justice was won and when justice was deferred. He is the author of Bus Ride to Freedom, which tells of his work in the Montgomery bus boycott. And he's also authored the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, an insider's account of the shocking medical experiment conducted by government doctors against African-American men. Attorney Gray, I teach your books in my courses. Fred Gray has received many, many notable awards, many prestigious honors, but this past summer, he received the nation's highest civilian honor when President Joe Biden conferred on him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He's wearing the Presidential Medal. I know I speak for myself and everyone here to say it is truly an honor to have your participation in ASALH's 107th Annual Conference. Now, I'd like to start with you, Professor Green. You've written a book on the Reconstruction era, and you are currently writing a book on how everyday African Americans remembered and commemorated the Civil War from 1863 to the present. So we'd love to hear about what you were thinking when you read Justice Deferred, and especially this earlier period from the Civil War and Reconstruction and the late 19th century. I know these are decades that you work on. So what were you thinking?
Hello, everyone. And I just want to thank everyone for being here. And I'm going to move this up so you can hear me. This book, if you haven't read it, please do. And then also too, I applaud the authors for developing a supplementary website as a companion, because then it goes into the cases and the other materials that they preview in the book, and it's a textbook all in itself. And for me, one of the things that really interested me was the first half of the book, because it made me realize how the Supreme Court was not just an advocate of civil rights and racial justice. And we think about that in the 20th century. But for me, it's the first chapters where you see the court as one that neutralizes law, dismantles, and commits, to borrow the term from the author, some serious backtracking. And this is where Reconstruction starts to matter, and those cases of the 1870s and 80s. But before I get to those, I want to really talk about one of the conundrums that the authors really set up in the beginning, is that the US Constitution supported the inherent contradictions of slavery for advancing liberty for propertied white men. And by doing that, the court's pendulum that shifts from justice to no justice to neutralization was set. And you can see this early on in the cases. And this is where I really like, because they bring in cases about Native American policy, Asian American policy, other races, and not just the African American experience. So in reading the context of Native policy of Cherokee versus Nation and summarizing those cases that leads to Trail of Tears, notably Worcester versus Georgia, you can see how the courts really was committed to one part of the Constitution, but then that inconsistency shaping the Amistad case for enslaved cargo, but again, hardening against African Americans in Prigg versus Pennsylvania and Dred Scott versus Sanford. And it's during Reconstruction, the second founding of this nation, that we really see the court early on neutralizing that revolutionary moment, in particular the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And I think it's therefore noteworthy and astutely shown with precision by the authors how these amendments and congressional legislation and shaping current shapes current jurisprudence and for the Supreme Court in the present. And for those in the audience, please read all sections of the 14th Amendment. Don't just read section 1, read all 5 sections, and also look at possibly the sesquicentennial anniversary that mustered the online blog for the Journal of Civil War Era led by Martha Jones and others did, because you can really see the way the courts interpreted new amendments that by the time they're doing these cases is less than 5 years old. They set the stage for Jim Crow, and they're setting the stage for a lot of the court's decisions of the present. And this is where I think one of the things I liked when reading this book that I do with my students is look at those courts of the 1870s and 80s and how it sets the stage for the civil rights cases of 1883 in Plessy. And really playing the what if section of the book. What if this would rule differently? What if? And for me, the cases that really came to me is what if Hall and versus Bilo, the prelude case, the slaughterhouse ruling, was ruled differently. Would the slaughterhouse cases, Cruikshank versus the United States, Reese versus the United States, which targeted the 14th and 15th Amendment, been ruled differently? Would then, if you look at those cases, if you look at what they did in Hall versus Bailu, would Harlan Justice then be the hero? Would an ex-enslaver like Harlan and an ex-Confederate turned justice been the sole outlier in the 1880 civil rights cases or Plessy? Would Jim Crow have emerged as it had? And more importantly, because I think about this quite often and I'm reminded of it reading this book, would Justice Clarence Thomas' intentional misreading of the era been allowed to stand in the present? Because he's looking at these cases. He's looking at that 14th Amendment and he has a very interesting take. And it's that take that kind of reminds me of then Reconstruction era justices who forgot the intent of those framers of those Reconstruction amendments. And they ignored it. And then how the 20th century becomes a slow march. But I think it's Reconstruction and those cases of Reconstruction that we see the blueprint for Jim Crow. And this is where I applaud the authors after going through the cases I teach all the time. My students, when they take my courses, they read the Constitution and they read Supreme Court cases and dissents. They get a lesson in the courts. They force us to look at other lesser known cases. When one expands to include beyond African Americans, to include the cases permitted all white juries, the ones shaping Native American policy and Chinese immigrants, then we can better contextualize the civil rights cases of 1883 and Plessy versus Ferguson as becoming more than cases that shape African American lives. Rather, we can look at the Supreme Court role in the emergence and legally sanction of a white supremacist project that affected all Americans. And race was always something that posed a conundrum, but they turned to serve to the more conservative side of the beginning, and Reconstruction and those new amendments forced another shift. And some of those corrections had occurred and leads that slow arc to freedom and justice. And I'm grateful to be on this panel with the esteemed Fred Gray, who I always admired, and those individuals who took another stand on what those amendments meant. But right now in the present, it is clear that the recent Supreme Court is sometimes characterized as rogue and sometimes ignoring precedent. Maybe we need to really look at what these 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s cases did, the court's rulings, as our playbook for how we move in the future and how we read this. And I liked it because one of the things that has concerned me is the shadow court dockets. How much of this Reconstruction era is done in backroom deals is now becoming the norm. So let us think about, are we shifting? Where's that pendulum going? And I think the 19th century tendencies, more so than the original framers, is where we need to go. So in conclusion, I just want to recommend this book be added to your library. It is a resource I know I'm going to be going to for my classes, my teaching, but also my future students who want to be lawyers. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, now we turn to Professor Harris, who is a scholar who writes broadly about the African-American historical experience. So thinking with that kind of broad view, what did the book say to you about the quest for racial equality and justice in America? I guess I'm asking you to ponder to what extent the courts have been effective, and have they been an effective tool in seeking racial equality in the United States?
Thank you very much.
Turn it on.
Okay, thank you very much, Evelyn, for the introduction and also for your question. As I read this book, there are a lot of questions that came to my mind. And there was a sort of a theme at Cornell University where the dean of faculty indicated that for faculty at Cornell, we always thought to the contrary. So whatever came up, we tried to take a contrary look at it to tease out, of course, greater meaning for the issues at hand. And for me, is racial justice and racial equality, are they the same? This is something I think that this book, at least for me, brings up. To what extent is litigation a route to racial equality? And we have all of these court cases, one in particular that I sort of intrigued by because it's in many respects personal for me. And that's the 1948 Shelley versus Kramer decision, which supposedly outlawed restrictive covenants. But neighborhoods, and I'm from Chicago, are as segregated today, if not more so, after the 1948 Supreme Court decision. Why, I ask, didn't the court take this further in looking at the exclusion of African Americans from certain neighborhoods? When my parents bought their house, there was a clause in the deed which said that they could not sell their house to a Negro or to a Jew or to an Asian. Now, that was the clause that Shelley versus Kramer supposedly struck down. But the practice of racial discrimination, segregation continued. And I know that this morning, Brian Stevenson talked about, among many things, and I thought he made a brilliant speech. And I think in some respects, he took on the criticism of critical race theory by the way in which he made his presentation. And I just mentioned that because I think that many of us have shied away from the term critical race theory because the way in which it's been demonized. We might not fully agree with Derek Bell, but Derek Bell raised some salient questions. And I think that part of that is followed through in this book, that the Supreme Court cases have provided only sort of marginal progress for African Americans, which also raises the issue of the way in which some of these cases have been argued. a bugaboo for me, and I know that Brian Stevenson is very much appreciative of Brown versus Board of Education. It opened up educational opportunities for him. But Brown versus Board of Education, the way it was argued, also created many problems for the future of young Black kids. Given the reliance on the why am I dropping the name now? The social scientists, the Clarks, yeah, the Clarks. You know, it put African-American students, I think, in a real bad position, I guess, best way for me to put it. Because given that they talked about the damage to the Black psyche, who would want their children to go to their children to go to school with Black students? I think of the lawyer, later Judge Robert Carter, who wrote part of the brief for Brown versus Board of Education. He reflected several years later that if he had to argue that case over again, he would rely more on educators than on the social scientists. And I think that would have made a difference. One last point I want to make, and that's with what we look at as the wealth gap today. Think of what happened to all of those Black teachers, those Black administrators after Brown versus Board of Education. These were individuals who were important members of the community, to be a school teacher, to be a school principal. And those individuals were basically removed together with their salaries. So when we look at the race gap, that's something we also need to consider. Those are just somewhat random thoughts that came to my mind as I was reading the book. And I think that they've done just a wonderful job, a magisterial job in pulling together these important court cases.
Thank you. And now we'll turn to Attorney Fred Gray. I just want to say before you speak, Attorney Gray, that I want the audience to know that he was described once by Martin Luther King Jr. as, and I quote, the chief counsel for the protest movement. And this is really important because when we think of what brought King into the national spotlight, what brought him into history, and we're right here in Montgomery, it is also what brought Fred Gray into prominence. Now, I ask my students, and I'll ask you, do you know how the Montgomery bus boycott started? And all of you will shake your head and say, of course. I know about Rosa Parks. I know about King. But when I ask my students, do you know what ended the Montgomery bus boycott? Very few people know. He was responsible for taking the case to court, and his victory is what ended the bus boycott. I'd like for you, if you don't mind, I really want Fred Gray to talk a little bit about this because most people don't know the Browder versus Gale case. And he's the only one of us here in the book.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Before I do what you've asked me to do and what Professor Burton and Attorney Duffner asked me to do, and they weren't all the same thing, but at least I listened to them. I want to thank the two authors of this book for inviting me to share this panel. I'm not quite sure why, other than I know I had worked with Attorney Durfner some years ago, but we hadn't talked in years when I got his call. And of course, once he called, I knew that I was gonna answer because for reasons best known to them, they asked me to come, and I'm happy to be here. Let me also acknowledge the presence of my wife, Carol. We are second marriages. She had been married for 30-some years, and I had been married for 40-some years, and we lost our spouse, and a mutual friend introduced us about 22 years ago, and she said she wanted the responsibility of taking care of me, and she's done a good job. There are a couple of other persons I need to acknowledge. Dr. Maurice Thompson, a wonderful one of your members, and for some reason best known to himself, he's just kind of taken a hold of me and helped me tremendously. And I want him to know I thank him. And when I got to some little problems about coming here, I went to him. And I knew he knew what to do. And so I'm here. I also want to thank Bill Perry. Bill Perry is from Tuskegee, and he is a part-time employee of the Tuskegee Human and Civil Rights Multicultural Center, which is the best small museum in the state. And he is also a volunteer here. And when I found out yesterday that he was a volunteer and I told him about my little problem, I just turned it over to him and it worked out fine. Thank you, Bill. Let me also thank my nephew, Thomas W. Gray Jr., because the chair told me she wanted me to talk a little bit about the Montgomery bus boycott. You can't talk about the Montgomery bus boycott, or the protest as we call it, beginning in 1955, because the problems that African Americans have made existed long before that. And Tommy agreed to do the little legwork in connection with our books. And I want to acknowledge President Randall Williams, who is the publisher of my two books, Bus Ride to Justice and Tuskegee Syphilis Study. He did it at a time before it was popular to print books dealing with civil rights in the early 90s. And when no other major publisher would end up doing it, he did it. And I want to thank you, Randall, for it. And he not only did that for me, but he probably has done more civil rights books than anyone else. I think I mentioned about Thomas. I appreciate that. Let me also mention Mr. Dr. Darrell Moulton of Alabama State University, who played a major role in getting high-ranking state officials to contact and write a letter to the president and urge him to grant to me the Presidential Medal of Freedom Award. I think I have covered most of these people that I need to be sure I cover. But now let me just tell you, and I think the best way to do it is, and of course, Bus Ride to Justice and Tuskegee Syphilis Study, we have them out there for sale for you. And the autobiography of mine, and I don't say it because it's mine, and I don't say it because Randall was the publisher of it, but I say it because it probably gives the most detailed account of the civil rights movement as it later developed from 1955 forward, up until the time of the republishing, which was in, I think, 2013 or 2014. So I thought it would be interesting for you to know, so you know I'm not just talking. But at the turn of the century, around 1900, you didn't realize it, you may not have known, but the African Americans in Montgomery had a protest against the old streetcars. They weren't being treated right. And they won that, only to lose it later on with the adoption of the Alabama Constitution of 1901. Then there were other things that happened. And let me just read to you a part of the inside cover to my niece's book, Kara and Gray Houston, who retired about 2 or 3 years ago from being a newspaper reporter in DC for Fox after being there for about 30 or 40 years. And she was able to go and contact a lot of the white people in the community who had ancestors who had done certain things. And she included it. But even more importantly, what this cover says is in 1950, before Montgomery, Alabama knew Martin Luther King Jr., before Rosa Parks refused to surrender her seat to a white passenger, before the city's famous bus boycott, a Negro named Hilliard Brooks was shot and killed by a white police officer in a confrontation after he tried to board a city bus. Thomas Gray, who had played football with Hilliard when they were kids, was outraged by the unjustifiable shooting. Gray protested, eventually staging a major downtown march to register voters and stand up against police brutality. 5 years later, he led another protest, this time against unjust treatment on the city's segregated buses. On the front line of what became the Montgomery bus boycott, Gray withstood threats and bombings alongside his brother, Fred D. Gray, the young lawyer who represented Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and rarely mentioned Claudette Colvin, a plaintiff in the case that desegregated the buses. So then you had this man who was killed. I don't even mention him by name in my book. I just mentioned the fact that one of the problems, a man had been killed who had an altercation on the bus. Then in 1948, this occurred in 1950. In 1948, Joanne Robinson, who was a professor at Alabama State College of English, and I knew her when I was a student there from 1948 to 1951, had had an altercation on the buses in Montgomery. She became the president of the Women's Political Council. And that council was a council that had was concerned about all the problems that Black people were having in the community. And they invited me to speak to one of the federated clubs, 10 times 1 is 10 Club, in October of 1955. And in that time, I told those ladies who were old enough to be my mother or grandmother that the time has come when we must do whatever it takes to desegregate all of our schools in our community. And I think that may have also helped in whatever that took place. So then, when I came back to Montgomery to practice law, when I was a when I was a student at Alabama State, I had to use the bus transportation system. And as a result of that, I realized that Black people had a problem. And while I had been trained a little something about being a preacher, and I went to Alabama State to become a teacher, but I decided that there were problems, and they told me lawyers help people solve problems. I made a commitment that I kept secret for a long time, and that is that I was going to go to somebody's law school, not apply to the University of Alabama because I wouldn't be admitted, and go out of school, take advantage of out-of-state aid that they would give us to keep us from going to Auburn, the University of Alabama, come back to Alabama, take the bar exam, pass the bar exam, and become a lawyer and destroy everything segregated I could find. I've done that 68 years. That leads you up to, and I had met Miss Parks when I was a student at Alabama State. And when I opened my office in October of 1954, Mrs. Parks was one of my hostesses who helped me open the office. She worked down the street from me at the Montgomery Fair, and I was at 113 Monroe Street. And every day she would come from the time I opened my office until December the 1st, 1955, when she was arrested. We would talk, we'd have our little meetings, and we even had a meeting. We would talk about the problems. We talked about Claudette Colvin's case. We talked about what a person should do if they have a problem on the bus and they decide they didn't want to give up their seats. And I told her that I was going out of town for an engagement that afternoon. She went back to her work. I went out of town. When I got back in town, I had all kinds of phone calls. I got a phone call from Mrs. Parks telling me she had been arrested and she wanted me to come to her house. I went to her house. She told me what happened. She retained me to represent her. This was on Thursday evening. And her case was set for 8:30 on Monday. So we didn't have much time. She knew I wasn't in town, so she called E.D. Nixon, Mr. Civil Rights in Montgomery, and asked him to go and get her out of jail. And Mr. Nixon decided that the white policemen probably may not let him go, so he got Attorney Durr to go along with him. They got her out. I went by and talked with her, and she retained me that evening to represent her. I said, well, Ms. Parks, fine. You don't have to worry about anything. I'll get back in touch with you between now and then. But, you know, I told her about Mrs. Joanne Robinson, and she knew about her and knew the problem she was having. And Mr. Nixon was always ready to do whatever he could. So I said, I'm going to go by Mr. Nixon's house. He only lived a few blocks from where Ms. Parks lived. Talked with him because Mrs. Robinson wanted to get the community involved. I wasn't concerned about a protest. I was concerned about filing a lawsuit. But what we did, we talked to Mr. Nixon, told him that I was going to go over to Joanne Robinson's house. And all of what I tell you, believe it or not, is in Bus Ride to Justice, and it's been there since the first edition of it, most of it. Some of it I didn't tell till a little later on. But to make a long story short, and I know I've taken more time than I should be taking, but I went and talked to Mr. Nixon and told him that Mrs. Parks has done, I think, all she needs to do, and she just if anybody is gonna get involved and getting the community involved, Ms. Joanne Robinson is a person who really needs to lead it. And I'm gonna leave your house, Mr. Nixon, and go to Joanne Robinson's house and talk to her. And that's what I did. She lived on the other side of town, the same side of town where Alabama State is, on Carey Street. And as a result of our discussion, there were several conclusions we reached, and I'm almost through. One was if we were going to ever have a protest, now is the time to do it. Two, I told Ms. Robinson that it takes a long time for a case to get all the way up to the Supreme Court. And that's where our case is going to have to ultimately go. So while we were talking about staying off of the buses for one day, I said, well, if we get them to stay off for one day, we got to be prepared if they stay off to be able to keep them off until they can go back on a non-segregated basis. And they agreed. And if that was going to happen, there were several things we needed to do. One, we needed to get the preachers involved because the Sunday that was coming up in a couple of days, they'd have more Black people there than any other place. And we could get the message out to them. But we also had two leaders, E.D. Nixon and Rufus Lewis. These two Black men needed to have key roles in it because you didn't want to miss anybody. And then, if it's going to be longer than a day, somebody is going to have to serve as a spokesman. Joanne stopped me and said, well, Fred, I tell you right now who the spokesman ought to be. My pastor, Martin Luther King. Haven't been here long, but one thing he can do, he can move people with words. I said, fine. I said, well, let me suggest to you the position for these other two Black leaders. E.D. Nixon is a Pullman car porter. His president of his union was A. Philip Randolph in New York. If he is made the treasurer, he'll raise some money to help us keep people off of the buses. What you're going to do with Rufus Lewis? Rufus Lewis was the owner of a nightclub in Montgomery on Miles Street. And in order to get in the nightclub, you had to be a registered voter. However, that doesn't have nothing to do with what we're trying to keep people off of the buses. But his wife, Jewel, was the co-owner of the largest funeral home in town. And guess what? Funeral home have cars and they have drivers, and they only use them when they are having funerals. So let's make Rufus Lewis chairman of the Transportation Committee. And you need one other person. You may need a lawyer. Here am I, send me. Mr. Nixon, we gave each other responsibilities, and Mr. Nixon had to leave the next day and go on the road and be gone for 3 days. But he contacted the president of the Ministerial Alliance and got a meeting set up for Friday evening at Dexter Avenue Church, which was the first official meeting. Now you know how it all started. I have sat in on meetings and people didn't know who I was when they're talking about the beginning of the boycott and everything. And I listen and I don't try to correct them. I just let them go right on and say what they say. And 90% of what they said was incorrect. But you have the beginning of the bus boycott. And I think it is worthwhile if you get a copy of Daughters of the Boycott, because it gives you a good background. And then these other books are available to you also. I'm sorry I took up too much time.
No, you didn't take up too much time. I do have to say this though, Attorney Gray, that you didn't tell us how you helped to end the boycott, because he took the case, Browder versus Gale, and Aurelia Browder was a person prior to Rosa Parks who had been arrested. And those were 4 women. In fact, Rosa Parks wasn't even on the, wasn't even one of the plaintiffs.
Well, what happened is 9 months before Rosa Parks did what she did, Claudette Colvin did what she did. She refused. She was a student, 15 years old, without any prior preparation other than she had been in a Black History Month program at her high school at Booker T. Washington in February, and this happened on March the 2nd. And they've been studying about the rights that African Americans have. And so they were out of school early on the 2nd of March. And so these Black kids walked downtown, caught their bus to go up on King Hill. And it was earlier than the bus they usually catch. So there were more white people on that bus than usual. As a result of that, we end up with white people coming on the bus, and these Black kids have been seated, not in the first 10 seats, which were always reserved. And as a matter of fact, Claudette Colvin was sitting in a seat just in front of the back door. But the white people had used all the seats up to that. The driver asked her to get up. She refused to get up. She said she'd been studying about Black History Month, and she's not in the white section, and she refused to get up. She didn't know anything about me. She didn't know anything. Her parents didn't either, but E.D. Nixon did. He contacted me and had her parents to contact me, and I represented her in the juvenile court of Montgomery County. I was prepared then to prepare a lawsuit for Claudette Colvin, but the community wasn't ready. And lawyers only represent clients. They don't represent themselves. So, but it served as a good purpose for us. And then when Mrs. Rosa Parks, we did decide that from that point on, we was gonna keep a record of everything that happened. And when Mrs. Parks' case did what she did, the community knew Mrs. Parks, and I was still ready to file a case, but they weren't quite ready. Finally, when Dr. King's house was bombed, the people decided, well, they're not going to change. So they came to me and said, lawyer, I think we're ready to file our case. We filed the case of Browder versus Gale, and I wanted to be sure that Claudette, if her parents wanted her to be, would be a plaintiff in that lawsuit, and she is and was. And Mary Louise Smith, another teenager that we found out later on had a similar experience, was in it, along with 2 seasoned other Black women in the lawsuit. And that lawsuit ultimately went up to the Supreme Court. And in late December of 1956, the mandate was received, and the schools and the buses were desegregated.
That's right. Thank you. So I'm not sure how much time we have now. Let's see, Michelle, 1 hour. Okay, so I just want very quickly, because I do want to get to the presenters. If Bob and Hillary and Fred even to say about the book, like what surprised you, or what, as you read it, what stuck in your mind, what inspired you, what stuck with you in a special way?
One of the things that struck me was the role of contingency and the way cases came out. So Cruikshank and Greece on the same day, 15th Amendment, and it reminded me how I felt this last couple seasons of the Supreme Court, how we sit with dread, how we are ready for, okay, what bombshells are we getting today? And when I read that, I can recall where I was when the Dobbs decision happened. I was at a Teachers Institute at SMU, and I just talked about the 14th Amendment. I just talked about these cases, and everyone was on their phone. And I'm like, oh, okay, Dobbs must have came out. And then I saw the tears. And then when I read this here, I'm like, I wonder what people in during those cases, when they read the case, who experienced like, well, what's next? And having both cases on the same day. What did they feel like me in that room? And we were having a very helpful, fruitful conversation. That's the timing. And that's what struck out with me, especially with those two particular cases.
Okay, thank you very much. One of the things that really stood out to me and struck me is the dependence that we've had, the reliance, and Attorney Gray might have something to say to this, the reliance on the court system for us to move toward racial justice. It's been a matter, and the authors do refer to this as sort of one step forward, two steps back. The movement toward freedom has been one that's slow, that's torturous, where we do get some victories, but then we get defeats. It seems as though, and I think they make reference to, it's important for us to look at the past because of the present moment that we're in, that it informs, maybe I'm paraphrasing this poorly, it informs the present. But it seems to me, and they might want to address this as well, that for racial progress in this country, it's been a zero-sum game. That for the country as a whole, for white Americans in particular, that they see African-American progress as a loss for them, not as something that is improving life for the country as a whole, but if you win, I lose. And if we're going to have a situation like that, I'm afraid to say that we're not going to make any progress. Thank you.
Thank you. Attorney Gray, did you want to speak about what was important to you? Now, I am, because he's been so important and he's modest. I just want to say that one of the things that struck me that I hope you will talk about is that you were involved in the Tuskegee, I don't know if you call it reparations, but it was a settlement for the people in Tuskegee. Now that the syphilis study, the victims, that study, I mean, that case never made it to the Supreme Court, so it's not in your book. But I do think there's a lesson that many cases never make it to the Supreme Court. And so this is a case, though, of a victory that I don't think most of us know. I know I learned about it much later than when it was actually settled. So if you could just tell us about that.
What has become known as the Tuskegee syphilis study, and I think the government called it the study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male, is what their published report said. The way I became involved in it was on the latter part, the last week of July of 1972. I was on a plane coming from Washington, D.C. en route to Montgomery. I was living in Montgomery at the time. No, still living in Tuskegee, but flying into Montgomery. And I read this story about these 600 and some men, half had syphilis and half did not, of this government study. And it was happening in Macon County. And I'd been living in Macon County now, this was 1963, and this is 72, and I hadn't heard about it. And I thought I was fairly knowledgeable of what was going on, but I hadn't. It developed that Gene Heller, an AP reporter, obtained from a whistleblower in California who ran across the story, tried to get his superiors to do something about it. They even brought him to Atlanta, but they didn't do anything. And finally, he released it to the press, and the story was there. The next day or so, after I got home, Mr. Charlie Pollard came into my office. He had a copy of the local Montgomery Advertiser that says Charlie Pollard was a successful black farmer in Notasulga, about 10 or 15 miles north of Tuskegee. And he said that he understood that he was involved in this study, but the government didn't tell him it was a study. And he think they had taken advantage of him. And he asked me whether I thought I could help him. I listened to him carefully, asked him a few questions, and told him, I think I can. That was my introduction to what I filed a year later, Charlie W. Pollard et al. Versus the United States of America et al. And as a result of that lawsuit, and we had syphilitics, we had controls, we had living people, we had dead people. We had a study that had started in 1932 and it wasn't known until 1972, 40 years. So it was a tough situation. And I tried to get the organizations I've been working with, NACP, and a lot of their cases is mentioned in the book, because the book that you have written really is not a book about lawyers and not about the plaintiffs really, but it is really a book about the Supreme Court and about the action that Supreme Court has taken. And this court never got there because we couldn't find the records. And finally, when we were able, I received a phone call from a man named Jim Jones, who was a historian and who knew where the records were. And he told me, he says, lawyer, I think I know where they are. I got on the plane, went to Washington, met him, and we found those records scattered in 400 and some boxes in the National Archives. As a result of that, the government then decided that they wanted to talk about settlement. Up to that point, there had been no such thing. But the interesting thing about this case is many of these lawyers who represented the government have been working with me on school desegregation cases and on other cases, and now we're on opposite sides. But to make a long story short, we were finally able to get the settlement and get the best amount of money we were able to get for them. Then I found out something else. I found out there was a group of people who were trying to get an apology for these men. But guess what? They did just like the federal government did. They didn't say anything to the participants. They didn't say anything to the participants' lawyer. they just started contacting the White House. I found out by a newspaper reporter calling me thinking I knew something about it, and I act like I did, but I didn't. But then I ended up getting in touch with my clients, told them about that. About that same time, Miss Evers' Boys had come out. And that was a play that ended up showing these not as men, but as boys going to juke joints and all those things, which they didn't understand. And I saw it when I was at a Black History Month up in New York and had my office to convene the living participants, and let's look at it. We looked at, as a result of that, we concluded, and I told them about this people trying to get the apology, and they hadn't been successful. I said, I think we know how we can get that done. And about that time, unfortunately, I lost my first wife. But Karen, who wrote the daughter of the boycott, and her husband, who was an assignment editor in New York, was down for my wife's funeral. And we talked about this whole thing and about trying to get a press release where these men could tell their story. We decided we would do that and had such a press conference on the 8th of April, 1997. As a result of that press conference, we had about 30 or 40 news media. It was the news, and I got a call from Bob Johnson from the president's office telling me that same night that tomorrow the president is going to make an announcement that he will make the apology. And he did that next day.
That was President Bill Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
President Bill Clinton.
That's right, President Bill Clinton. And that was on the 16th of May, 1997. And I told Bob Johnson when he called me, I say, I want you, don't do like all these other people did. Don't exclude the participants from participating. He says, you're gonna be our contact person. And he was. And I was able to get Mr. Herman Shaw, who was the most articulate one of them, to introduce the president. And in introducing the president, he thanked the president for bringing them there. Sorry it was so long, but it's better late than never. And then he said, I want you to know, Mr. President, that I am a co-founder of the Tuskegee Human and Civil Rights Multicultural Center, which is a museum in Tuskegee, which is to be a museum in Tuskegee as a permanent memorial for us. And we want you to help. The president got up and told him that he's going to have a birthday on that next Sunday and he was going to help him. But the president didn't quite understand that was something else that some other people wanted that the president was talking about. But in any event, while we didn't get the money that others have gotten who have gotten money on the back of these men, we started from scratch, got a local bank to give to the Tuskegee Human and Civil Rights Multicultural Center a building. Then my daughter, who had just finished doing some work over in Atlanta for the Olympics, said, well, Daddy, I'll come over and try to help you get it started. And we started it 25 years ago. It is now one of the best small museums in the country and in this state. And the Alabama Department of Tourism will tell you when you compare to all the others, it is there. So I just want you to know that the Tuskegee Human and Civil Rights Multicultural Center would be happy to join with this organization and any others in helping to preserve history, because this organization now preserves not only the history, but the life. And if you see what we have in Tuskegee, it does three things, and I'm through. One, it shows the contribution made by the three ethnic groups that has made this country: Native Americans, Americans of European descent, and Americans of African descent. Secondly, it serves as a permanent memorial for those men in the study. And if you go to go to the center, it's a bank building with a large chandelier right in the middle that comes from the top all the way down. Underneath it is all 623 names in marble, where you can read the names as far away as 25 or 30 feet. Then there's a kiosk that tells you about the history of it. And around the top of the balcony, there are pictures of men. They don't have the names. They weren't concerned about the names. They wanted the men and they wanted their blood and to do whatever else they wanted to do. And well, those men told me that they wanted me, if I could, to start that museum. The last thing I needed to do to get, at my age then, to get involved, but we did it. And then the third thing is, it is a brief history of the struggle of African Americans from slavery to the present time. You'll find all of the constitutional amendments, you'll find all of the federal laws, you'll find all of the states, and there are 4 of those cases are precedent-setting cases that started by residents of Macon County. And I also want you, because people talk about the voting rights trail from Montgomery to Selma, from Selma to Montgomery. But long before any of the things I've talked with you about it, early as 1945, African Americans in Macon County, William P. Mitchell and others, was filing lawsuits to obtain the right to vote. So we need your help in getting the federal government to extend the voting rights trail from Montgomery to Tuskegee. And we need your support.
Thank you so much. And now we will hear from our authors. So please respond. And then after about half an hour or so at most, we'll turn to the audience. Thank you.
One of the things that struck me in studying the civil rights movement and the cases in Alabama, I think Alabama was the worst in terms of all the tricks they played, how many times you had to go forward, sometimes as many as 4 on appeals as they would try one thing or another to deny you. It was an extraordinary, I think, story of courage. So I encourage, if you do read the book, turn to Alabama and see what this extraordinary attorney did against all the odds. And I want to start out with one thing, because the book is Justice Deferred. That's a play off the Langston Hughes. And if I have time, I'll read the last paragraph that it explains it. But the subtitle is, race. And this is interesting about writing this book. We know there's no such thing as race. Now, whether you are a geneticist and a scientist and just say, or you take your worldview as I do from a faith perspective and believe that God created us, she created us all in her image. So we're all alike. There's no such, and yet I think the federal courts, but particularly the Supreme Court, has got off easy, at least in my mind, coming of age with the Warren Court, because we sort of saw it as doing the right thing. But the court created this social construct, we historians like to call it, this fake thing called race, but it's become a category that has worked to discriminate against groups of people, and particularly African Americans. I just want to put that there because it was tough for this title to put in the title something I don't believe exists. And since this, to give you an example how the Supreme Court did it, since our theme is help, when we discussed the Bakke case, it's a great example of something we found throughout the book. what they said, the Bakke case is, well, we can't really rule, you know, for what we would think up Africa, because there's no evidence of discrimination against minorities and particularly Black people. And now, this is interesting, we have so much evidence. Even the American Medical Association is apology. I mean, it's just documented. And so the court says, well, that doesn't really matter now. And that's what we found throughout the book. They keep changing the goalpost. I would encourage people to look at chapter 11. This, I think, is a very original argument. It's hard for an author to think that, but Armin and I worked on it, argued about it, fought over it. My wife always got the final word. She always voted with Armin. So if anybody wants to see the best stuff that got cut out, I'll send it to them. The war of words between purpose and effect, and it's everywhere, but we are particularly have worked a lot together on voting rights. And so when you could see the effect, that are you have to have intent. And if you had the intent to say, well, you have to prove the effect. And it's gone back and forth over the years. And maybe briefly, Armin, do you want to talk about how we started this? We've been working on this forever, and how a historian got involved in 1980 when I started working with you.
You can talk about that later.
Okay.
What I wanted to, I think I'm gratified to be on this panel and to have these panel members. Fred Gray, you know, needs no introduction here or anywhere, but the book is speckled with important cases. We've heard about the Montgomery bus boycott. We've heard about the Tuskegee voting case. Also, Alabama tried to run the NAACP out of the state. It took 4 Supreme Court cases to stop them. Fred was instrumental in that. Alabama and Fred Gray are center stage. Professor Green highlighted one of the main reasons we wrote this book. The Supreme Court's been deciding cases for 200 years, and we have about 200 cases in this book. But they're not just random. In other words, Professor Green talked about the pattern in the 19th century. And what we found and what we're trying to portray is the whole history has been a pattern. If you think about the Warren Court, if you think about times when the Supreme Court was doing some good things about race, that comes from a short period, the 1930s to the early 1970s. And Professor Green has highlighted the fact that, the pattern is there. So before the 1930s, the court was doing mostly bad things. Since the 1970s, it's gone back to just where it was before, or worse in some cases. And the other thing we were trying to show is these are not random, or these are not dictated. When judges decide cases and write opinions, they have choices, and the choices that they make reflect the values that they have. There's no such thing as, well, this case is automatically going to be decided this way. The law is clear. There's no such thing as a case decision that is not a choice of the justices. So we had 100 or more years of justices making choices to continue slavery and Jim Crow, and then a short period, about 40 years, in which it ended up with the Warren Court. It started a little bit earlier with Chief Justice Hughes, Judge Higginbotham had written this wonderful article about Chief Justice Hughes. So there's that little period. And then since that time, it's gone again. The justices are making choices now, just as they made choices before. And so when they come up with terrible decisions, as they have now, they can't get away with saying, oh, that's what the law is. They are making that choice. Mm-hmm. And then turning to Professor Harris, he mentioned a number of things, and I'm proud that one of the things we did in the book was not just say, well, here's this case and it did this. We talked, for example, he talked about the restrictive covenant case, Shelley versus Kramer in 1948. Well, right after we discussed that case, the next section in the book is titled, What Did the Shelley Case Actually Do? And then we talk about the fact that there was, the suburbs were growing, there was federal aid to suburbs, white developers. And so the insurance companies, the banks, the real estate brokers, they, at the same time that the piece of paper was no longer legal, the problem is that the exclusion of African Americans from the new suburbs was going on at the same time. We talk about that. We also talk about, for example, I think Professor Harris mentioned this issue about school desegregation. Well, after we talk about the Green case in 1968, which finally said delay, all deliberate speed is over. You got to desegregate now. Then we have several paragraphs talking about what was the real impact and the fact that what happened then, yes, there was desegregation of a sort, but who lost their jobs? Which coaches became assistant coaches? Which teachers were fired because they were thought, well, they might be good teachers for Black kids, but we can't have them teaching white kids. So we've tried to talk in the book about what's behind the cases, what comes after the cases. And I'm still waiting for somebody to say we got something wrong, except for a few dates. I will say this, we got the date wrong when George Wallace pardoned Clarence Norris. We got that date wrong.
Which is corrected on the website now.
Okay, good. Anyway, it's an honor to be here and to listen to these excellent people talking about.
Let me respond to Armand, to Bob's, with the first picture in the book. You probably can't see it, but it is Cecil Williams, a great chronicle, particularly of South Carolina, the civil rights movement. Extraordinary. He's 13 or 14 years old when he takes this picture of the great Thurgood Marshall getting off of what people call the silver meteor. Some railroad historians would argue with you, but historians can argue about everything. It's an extraordinary moment there, but what I wanted to do was add one of the things he said. This is right after the Grovestown boys. He's almost lynched in Florida. And this is to you too, Bob, and I think to all of us. We think of the civil rights movement, how it did so much for African Americans, but I think Thurgood Marshall gives the bigger context. And this is what he said about this time. Sometimes I get awfully tired of trying to save the white man's soul. Now, we haven't, there's no doubt that Derek Bell is right about so much with what is called, and I think wrongly vilified, critical race theory. But I like to remind people, ending segregation did not give us integration. We haven't had integration. We're still working toward that beloved community. I hope we're still working for that.
I'll say something about critical race theory too. To me, critical race theory is simply recognizing that at the heart of what goes on in this country, especially in the South, race is almost always there. And that's all critical race theory is recognizing the reality. And I will say this, when I was younger and more naive, I used to think that, say, for South Carolina, where I live, 90% of everything that the state did was about race. And now I realize what an underestimate that was.
Let me just finish up though. Think about what segregation and being taught all your life, white children, that they are superior. You know, Bob was referring to the psychology studies of the dolls and things, but think of the other side of that, what that did to people's minds, psyche, and souls, the horrors and tragedy as well. It doesn't equal the horrors that happened to Black. I'm not trying to say that, but I really think the great Thurgood Marshall was trying to save the soul of America. And he hardly ever lost against all odds at Supreme Court. Then he gets on the court and he hardly ever wins again. And I want to say, it sounds like this book is about court cases. They're there, but it's about people. It is the stories of people, not just Thurgood Marshall, but so many others. And I hope you'll tell the story, Armand and Miss Mary.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories is this Mary, what was her name?
I'm blanking too. Pardon? Hamilton, Miss Mary Hamilton.
Hamilton, right. And it happened in Alabama. And she was in a demonstration, and this is in the book. She was in a demonstration and she got arrested. And so she was on trial. and on trial for some petty offense, which they would fine her $10 or whatever. And the prosecutor said, okay, Mary, now where were you? She said, my name is Miss Mary Hamilton. He said, okay, Mary. She said, I'm not going to answer your questions until you address me correctly, meaning the way white women get addressed. And the judge says, answer the question. She said, no, not until. He said, you're in contempt. So he fined her $50, and I think she did 5 days in jail or something like that. And that went to the Alabama Supreme Court, which naturally affirmed the conviction. And then the US Supreme Court, which takes maybe 100 cases out of thousands and thousands of cases every year. It's in 1964. Supreme Court took that case just to reverse that conviction. And that was because the Supreme Court of that day, this is the Warren Court, Supreme Court of that day understood what so many people didn't understand, except people in this room know it, which is that getting called by a name was one of the things at the heart of the dual system, at the heart of slavery and Jim Crow. So the court got it. And now we wish the court of today would get a little bit more.
You can't
Yes, I
see it,
think,
but this is a picture of her with her pearls on.
Yeah, Pearl.
Head of poor is extraordinary woman.
Thank you. I think
Great.
Attorney Gray, you wanted to say.
I think several things. One, I think the book is certainly well written. It discusses and documents all these Supreme Court decisions over a long period of time. So I'm sure that the law professor has something to do with that part of it. It's not about lawyers, it's not about plaintiffs, it's about the Supreme Court and how the Supreme Court has acted and ruled on cases involving race. I wanted to ask really the authors, and when I read a book, I'd like to go away with hoping I've gone away with what the authors want. But since we didn't get a chance to get them to tell us up front what they were trying to do or what they would like to have us go away with, I really would like for them to just make a few comments on when somebody read this book, what do you expect or what would you like for them to go away with?
Well, didn't you say, Vernon, you had a paragraph you wanted to read us?
I could read the last paragraph because, you know, Armin and I have discussed this. We don't know who wrote what sentence. I think we wrote them all, Armin, pretty much together. I mean, it's amazing. I think this book had not been written before because I don't believe any historian could have written it, just as you said. And Armin, and we've spoken at law schools and people have said the same thing. No law professor, you have studies of Plessy v. Ferguson, Brown v. Board, Armistead, but to put them all together, and that's part. And one of the things that came out of this, when we got pretty depressed about where the court was going now, we had to remember that as historians, if you take a generation, you know, as in fact about 25 years, and we begin with the first, what we call race laws, which is, we don't believe is anything, but there are laws that we have had 12 generations in which the law discriminated, enforced white privilege and white supremacy. And we've only had 2 generations. When you think of it in those terms, Bob, only 2 generations to sort of move away. There is some hope there. And I think that resonates with what Byron Stevenson said at lunch too. I mean, it's not wrong to look at it the other way, but we struggled at the end from where the court is now on race. We even did something a historian should never do. We predicted Bronovich, and unfortunately we were right about where it was coming. Now, this is the latest case. Everybody knows about Shelby County, which gutted the civil rights movement, the most effective part. And now Alito has really gone after what's left is Section 2. And we're very worried the case is coming, but we were struggling again. So we thought about the generation, and this is our conclusion. There's a young woman mentioned here that we didn't think anybody would know who she was, but you'll discover she got discovered when our book was in page proofs coming out. It's in a 1951 poem, the Harlem Renaissance bard Langston Hughes asked, "What happens to a dream deferred?" History, shaped by the court's unfolding interpretations and limitations on rights, tell us that justice has been deferred too long. Abraham Lincoln challenged us, determine that the thing can and shall be done, and then we shall find the way. We take inspiration from the young people who will be writing the next chapter. In 2019, 2020, the U.S. Youth Poet Laureate Amanda Gorman gave readings around the country of a poem she had been commissioned to write for Independence Day. In her performance at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Gorman, an African-American woman from Los Angeles who was a student at Harvard, explains that she sees American democracy not as something that's broken, but as something that's unfinished. Rather than falling prey to discouragement, she speaks of being audacious in taking up the mantle of our founders and playing her role in finishing their work. In her poem, Believer's Hymn for the Republic, she declares, "Every day we write the future together." I think what Armin and I were trying to do, I think we were trying to tell the story of that artificial social construction of race from before there was a constitution to today through the lens of the Supreme Court. So that's what we're trying to do. We don't want to leave people discouraged. We want to say that if Fred Gray spent his life making this a better world, then we need to do the same thing. And I'm so encouraged by young people. I actually, and not just young Black people, I don't think young white people want to discriminate. I don't think they want to be prejudiced. We have failed them in education, so they don't know about a lot of this, and that's part of what we're trying to address here as well. But I have great hope, or my hope is in the future. It's not just that we're becoming a majority minority country, but that I think if you look at what happened, I didn't think this was happening in my lifetime, at the acceptance of particularly young people of gay and lesbian and others marriages, and how no one sort of thought that how quickly that has become something that people accept. And I think that is to be attributed to people don't want to be prejudiced and that they want everyone to have equal opportunities. I know it's sort of a dream, but I think that people have to keep dreaming to work toward that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Excuse me. This theme that we had 12 generations of slavery and Jim Crow, and we've only had 2 generations of trying to overcome it. Things happen slowly. History doesn't necessarily move in one direction, but we can get too wrapped up in the problems of today, especially when we see the Supreme Court trying to turn the clock back. But I remember a lunch that I had with Judge Matthew Perry and another African-American judge in Charleston, Bernard Fielding, who was a probate judge. And both of them said the same thing, because they had grown up and gone to become lawyers back in the 1950s and so forth. And each one said the same thing. I have seen things happen that I never dreamed I would live to see. So we can talk about all the work we have to do, and we certainly have to do it, but we should not lose sight of the fact that once upon a time, things were worse.
Yeah, and I want to say that how I got involved with Armin, and I reminded Armin of this because with what happened with Shelby, what happened with Baranovich, civil rights lawyers are pretty upset. But I said the same thing as Yogi Berra would say, deja vu all over again. This was 1980, and Armin and Lachlan McDonald and Frank Parker, and I bet you were too, were just as upset in 1980 when it said it didn't matter in Alabama and Mobile that a laws structured the voting so that African Americans could not elect someone. You had to show the intent. And at that point, I remember some wits, maybe in the Birmingham paper, they saying, well, what are we going to do? Dig up the policymakers and say, did you intend? Was it your purpose to keep blacks from being elected?
Now we have to get to the audience.
Well, at any rate, that's how historians I got involved and other historians in 1980. That's what historians do. We look at motivation, and judges can accept those arguments. And there are legal rules, I mean, that you have to abide by in showing that. And this is what Bravanovich is doing, is trying to say, well, that doesn't matter anymore. So.
Well, thank you. Now we are going to turn to our audience at this point for questions. And I do need to know also if there are questions in the live chat, because I want us to go back and forth from in-person to virtual. So if I will take the first question. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, this really isn't a question. Is you mentioned Langston Hughes. You used what happens to a dream deferred, and actually what happened to a dream deferred was Watts, Chicago, Detroit.
Mhm. Is there another question or comment?
Somebody's from way back.
Let me just say something quick about what happens to a dream deferred. The poem,
Somebody
I
has
mean,
their
the
hand up
play,
back.
Raisin in the Sun,
Somebody has their
was
hand up.
written, as we know, by Lorraine Hansberry.
They're picking-
And one of the things we talked about in the book is that in 1940, Lorraine Hansberry was 10 years old, and her family won a case in the Supreme Court that allowed them to move to the house that they lived in Chicago for many years. And so Lorraine Hansberry was, in a sense, the beneficiary of a Supreme Court case.
I'll let the people, whoever's in charge, identify who wants to speak. I haven't received any cards from anyone for the virtual, so I don't know how to get their voices into this. Is somebody going to read their questions?
I'd like to commend all of the panelists for a wonderful and illustrated presentation of things that we know, but we don't often operate on. A long time ago, Aristotle said that justice and equality are essentially the same thing, but no ruler who wants to remain long in power will ever admit to that. And I think that what you all have done is to show how true that is, and to also show how when people, ordinary people, intervene in the circumstances of their own life, they can, in effect, make justice and equality the same thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? It seems like we don't right now have, there's a person over here.
Hello. I'd like to start with, we started with the Reconstruction. The defeat of Reconstruction, which was bloody and organized by the federal government in collaboration with the former slave owners, to smash the growing collaboration between small farmers who were white and who were black, and to divide us and drive us apart so they could exploit us all more. That's the greatest defeat that's ever been suffered by toilers in this country. The young people and the working people who fought in the 50s and 60s began to overcome that division. Not all the way. We got a lot more work to do, but at least we work in some of the same workplaces now, in the same jobs, at the same rates of pay, which was not true before the civil rights movement. The final thing is I'd like to say, the Constitution and I'd like what you think about this. The Constitution prohibits the government from doing certain things to us. It's called the Bill of Rights. They can't search us. They can't invade your home. They can't stop you from assembly, from petition, from organizing, from speaking. They can't stop you from practicing your religion. And I think the most important thing the Supreme Court can do is guarantee the government doesn't do that to us. And if the government doesn't do that to us, we can organize and fight to change the world. That's where it'll happen. It's not the Supreme Court that got rid of Jim Crow. It was the fighters of the 50s and 60s who did it. So
We had a person over on this side too, before we go back over there. Is that person still here? It would be good if we can just go to each section to make sure everyone got in there.
I will be brief. This question is, I want to thank you, Dr. Higginbotham and everyone on the panel. The question is for Attorney Gray. Attorney Gray, a question, in our class on Black liberation movements, we read Alden Morris and Origins of the Civil Rights Movement. I'm wondering from your perspective, how much communication, coordination was there between like Baton Rouge, which was like a year before Montgomery, and other places where the sit-in movements took place and the boycotts took place? Was there much coordination and communication between Montgomery, Alabama, and Baton Rouge and Tallahassee and other places where the movements would start?
We were aware that there had been some problems in the places that you've indicated. Some of the individuals may have contacted some of the persons there, but I don't think it played any major role involved in it. We pretty much understood what our problem was in Montgomery, and we had come up with what we thought was a good plan. And the plan, one, was to get the community involved and stay off of the buses until they could go back on a non-segregated basis. And of course, we ended up throwing a lot of little things out there to see if they would do. And it ended up that the small things we wanted done, they didn't do. So we ended up filing the lawsuit, which is what we knew we was going to have to do in the final analysis.
Could you,
Did you ever think of starting a bus company in Montgomery? A bus company that would basically, I mean, given the organization of the carpools and whatnot, what do you think the next step could have been starting a bus company?
Because the bus company, at least counsel for the bus company, probably was one of the ones responsible for them not accepting the little three things we initially asked for. He felt it couldn't be done on the existing laws, but it was being done down in Mobile. But I just don't, and of course, the bus company, eventually, they just became bankrupt for the most part, yeah.
thank you. I saw a hand, yes.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to put the question in a more global context: democracy versus autocracy, and the whole thing of fascism, that we have countries in the world and autocratic leaders. One of the first things they do is to control the courts and then the media. That is a fear we need to face in this country, because it is happening globally and fascism is happening here. And I know we want a bright outlook, but we must be aware and on our toes, because it is happening at many places and could happen here. Thank you.
And I just want to second what you're saying, that history itself, someone mentioned Reconstruction, you know, the mythology there, it was the most successful progressive period in American history. And yet and it was a coup d'etat. It was the overthrow here in America. It was the overthrow of a legitimately elected interracial governments in several states through terror. You know, people think that terrorism started with 9/11, but African Americans in the United States lived in a terrorist society at least in 1965. And if you look at what happened with some of the police things now, you got to wonder if it stopped then. But that's happened in America. That was a coup d'etat, an overthrow of a democratically elected, little d, democratically elected interracial government through violence, intimidation. So it's happened here in America.
In that Cruikshank case, they killed people who were elected.
That's right. And they said, as long, of course, if it's not state-sponsored, kill them. And the minute that came down, we have not proved, I think I will one day, Hamburg massacre in South Carolina, they're corresponding. Cruikshank comes down and they massacre people, African Americans in the town of Hamburg, in the elephant. They knew, they followed the laws. The laws were justification. This is part of what we're saying. The Supreme Court's got an easy ride for a long time for being above this.
Mhm.
But people know how to use the courts and the law.
Thank you. I see a hand.
I'm listening at the conversation concerning the Supreme Court. And my observation is that it seems like we make strides, but then we eventually, in so many years, we go backwards again. So at this present time, what I'm seeing what's going on now with the Supreme Court, and a lot of the voting rights are being taken away. Where do we go from here? I mean, we fought every type of fight that we could fight. People have died to gain these rights, and now, another set of Supreme Courts that are there for life. What do we do?
May I
Vote.
just say that one of the things where we go from now is to the voting booth.
Mhm.
Because if we do not vote, we will not have not only the power of a president that will make decisions and put people on the court, at the state level courts, which are very important, and your school board. It's so many levels where votes are determined that if we don't vote, some of the things that we are seeing now, we won't be able to overturn.
And we forget that we're not a parliamentarian form of government. It's a winner take all. So that person who's on that board, if you don't have a seat at the board, gets to do what they want to do.
Mhm. Over here, I see a hand.
Thank you very much. I'm Yvonne Ace from Memphis, Tennessee, and I'm president of my branch in Memphis. And I want to say I'm very proud to be here the second time in Osala. And I'm looking at that word race, and I'm going to have difficulty taking that term back and explaining that it's not it's a social construct and it doesn't exist. How am I going to re-educate some people that are left behind and are not here today? And I want to make sure that I bring them on board, because if they don't get on this train now, they might not ride right now. So how can I put them on the train in the front seat and re-educate them? And I'd like to have your perspective, so when I go back, I'll have your answer and not mine. Thank you.
But remember, racism's still there. That's very different than the distinction.
And all the new discoveries about genetics and genes and chromosomes and ancestry.com and 23.com, they are showing us that there's nobody pure. If you go back in your life, you'll find, if you're white, you'll find black people in there. If you're black, you'll find white people, other kinds of people. The more we learn, the more we realize that what we've been taught for generations or centuries is baloney.
I saw he's standing, so.
Based on time, this should be our last question.
Yeah, your comment or your question led right into mine. Thank you all. So many good points were made. I think the two most salient takeaways that I felt were one, Professor Burton, your point about race having no scientific basis. And, you know, the Human Genome Project, I think, showed that 98.2% of human DNA is identical. So every difference we can perceive is 1.8%. So there's that. The other one, Professor Harris, was the notion, this zero-sum equation. I think that is such a key to the manipulation and the dividing and conquering of the American people. The idea that if Black people get jobs, that means white people are losing jobs, as if something was taken away from them that they otherwise deserved. And I guess my question is, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how do we, the book is of course a beginning, but how do we kind of get control of that discourse really at the popular level, not just like in academic settings, and kind of turn that propaganda offensive on its head. So just interested to see if, what thoughts you have. Thank you.
You answered.
Thought it was to Bob. I thought it was you, Bob, about the zero sum, I believe, but I can't.
It's not a zero-sum game. How do we teach people that it's not a zero-sum game? And what we have found, if you look back in recent history, when the country has been doing better, everybody does better. The opposite of the zero-sum game is that a rising tide lifts all boats. And that's what I believe is true. And we just have to, maybe we have to just get a better slogan than zero-sum game. Maybe a rising tide lifts all boats is a slogan.
Well, I think that part of the problem is that we basically teach and everything is set up for some people to gain advantage and not to be willing to give up something, to sacrifice. And I'm going to get a little religious here. I think if the churches on Sunday or on Saturday taught what they're supposed to teach, that things would be very different.
Mm-hmm.
And partly what Bob's saying is education. And when we get depressed, think about how much I really think school teachers have been doing God's work. People now understand. I mean, it was just a few years ago when Ken Burns filmed that, people were denying that slavery had anything to do with the Civil War. Now, everybody, even Sons of the Confederacy will admit that. And that's partly how long it took for where students in graduate school, when Bob and I were there writing, knew this stuff, but it took that long to get there, the idea of contingency. I think that Brian Stevenson again gives a warning. I think that maybe we're making progress in education, and that may be why certain legislators are trying to stop us from education. I think is a key. I think that's why African Americans have always treasured education. Dr. Ben May spoke about that. They used to do these social polls that would surprise people, the kind of ranking thing of all groups of people, more than those who identified as Jewish or Italian or anything else. African Americans put education at the top of what was most important. in terms of social status and things like that. The belief, and I don't think that belief is wrongly placed, but we have to tell the truth in our education, and we've got to be allowed to. I was really moved by Brian Stevenson's talk. I thought he hit the nail on the head. And I think we've got to be courageous enough to stand up to people and say, as he did, certainly in my faith, in the church I was reared in, you said, I was wrong, I have sinned. That was part of the conversion. And we believe in redemption. That's something I thought he might talk about. You know, the Armin and I talked with the LDF earlier in years when we were doing voting rights cases about using the churches, about incarceration. We believe in redemption in the church. I don't mean to put Armin in the church. I'm sorry. I'm his church going friend. But that's part of the faith that I have is redemption, that we believe in redemption. And so that's something we need to reach out. One of the problems is the other side have become masters of manipulating language. I'll give one example. Redemption. I have written about this, but what do they call this overthrow of the government? This,
Redemption.
what I talked about earlier, the coup d'etat, redemption. That's a word I grew up in the Baptist church learning, redemption. And instead, that side has used that term to get, and that's what they're doing with critical race theory and everything. They are masters at taking words. We've got to be better and stand up to those words and say,
So,
And
you
I
know,
just-
I'm sorry.
I was just going to echo, we need education because one of the things that shows me is that we are so successful in achieving in spite of, and despite the obstacles that we are the ones who built this country and have shaped this country and have made justice and waited for deferring of dreaming. But that has to admit that we were more successful than the founders intended, and that threatens the people who were complicit and who didn't have to do that work. So education and truthfulness, but also we're going to have to reckon with slavery and reckon with what happened after the Civil War, what we never did. And that means we have to have truthful conversations about Reconstruction violence, lynching, the role of institutions of higher ed in supporting white supremacists after defending white supremacists as lawyers for slavery. They just became white supremacists for Jim Crow. And lawyers trained for Jim Crow. We need a full-on reckoning on all that work. And we need to learn more about Fred Gray and the work here because we're tired. But knowing Fred Gray's story gives me hope to keep on going. So where is hope that we've always shown as a people to push forward?
Thank you.
After 68 years of law practice, I was naive enough to believe when I started the practice of law in Alabama that if the white power structure in this state would see that African Americans could